Okay, so the question is, how can I go over the standard error of each type of confidence interval? So I'm going to look at basically the last 2 pages of your note spiral. And this is a standard error for a one sample z-test, which is going to be very unlikely because you have to know the standard deviation of the population. Well, here's the standard deviation of the population. Here's my mean, but my standard error part is this part right there. Now, the part that I'm going to circle, I don't know if it'll show up as purple, but it's in purple, is the margin of error. So this is the margin of error. And this is the standard error. And you're like, well, how do I know to use this one? And how do I know to use a z? Because I have the standard deviation of the population. So I have to have the standard deviation of the population to use this one. Over here, once again, this is my standard error. And S, and now I'm working with the standard deviation of my sample. So that's different than this. So that means I'm working with a t. And I'm only working with one sample mean. And this part right out here that I circled in purple is my margin of error. Okay. And then this right here is for a paired sample. Once again, this is my standard error. And notice it's exactly the same thing, except we're looking for the paired differences. All right, we were looking for the paired differences. And because it came from the sample, this is my margin of error. So how do I know, once again, on what to do here? They gave me the standard deviation of the population. This, my standard deviation came from the sample. This, my standard deviation came from the sample. So I'm going to pause right here to see if there's questions on that part before I move forward with this. Zoom recording. All right, so continuing on with the standard error. So with a 2 sample mean, this is my standard error, and this is a standard deviation of the first sample. This is standard deviation of the second sample, and this part right here represents the standard error. Now, we have a difference here. Yes, this is my margin of error, and that's no different. But the way we calculate T star is going to be different. To get T star, run the test. I know you don't know it yet. Run the test, and it'll give you a T star value. And it's probably going to be some decimal. It's going to probably be 2 or 3 digit number that ends in a decimal. I mean, but that will give, to get your degrees of, I'm sorry, not your T star. You run the test to get your degrees of freedom. Your degrees of freedom will come from the calculator. It's real important on that. Whereas up here, the degrees of freedom is n minus 1. Here, the degrees of freedom are n minus 1. And on this one, when you go to Z star, you're going to have to plug in mu equals 0, standard deviation equals 1. That's what you're going to need to do in order to get Z star there. For T star, degrees of freedom n minus 1. T star again, degrees of freedom n minus 1. But over here, you're going to get the degrees of freedom from the calculator. Okay? When you move on to linear regression, I really wouldn't worry about any of these formulas right here. This formula is important, and this formula is important. You're like, well, where did SB come from? SB comes from the computer output, and generally speaking, it'll be the standard error of the slope. It'll say either standard deviation of the slope or standard error of the slope, and they'll have already divided it by 2, and all you have to do is go T star times this. Big difference here, big difference. This is going to have to be divided. Your degrees of freedom is n minus 2. Once again, this part right there, standard error. This part right here, margin of error. Moving on to, you know what, let's pause. Okay, proportions. All proportion tests are going to be Z's. So we have a Z here and a Z here. This part right here that I just circled is my standard error. And notice It's a p hat and a q hat. All right, this value came from the sample. This came from p hat equal x over n. So the number of successes over what I was interested in. This right here represents my margin of error. This right here represents my margin of error. And this represents my standard error. Now, this is the one that gets a little bit different, okay? Because over here, my standard of error is the one that has to be the combined, and that's for the hypothesis test. So this one has a different one. The rest of them, whether you're running a hypothesis test or a confidence interval, are essentially the same.